Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to give you my review of the Sirui Aurora 85mm F1.4. This is an important lens for Sirui because it is their first autofocusing full-frame lens. It's also their first lens with a number of some of the new and included features that they have. It's starting off very competitively by offering a 2024 early bird discount of $499 US, $100 off, and they're including 2 filters. The Sirui Aurora has some strengths and weaknesses relative to the other 85mm options, but the overall buzz that I'm seeing seems to be very positive. So is it worth buying? Well, we'll explore that in today's review. Today's episode is brought to you by Into the AM and their great collection of graphic tees and hoodies designed by local artists. There are tons of deals right now, so visit intotheam.com/Dustin10 for an extra 10% off. So let's start by taking a look at the build handling the overall design features of this lens today. First thing that really kind of stood out to me is great presentation. The box itself is nice. There is a nylon padded case, the included filters as previously mentioned. All of that added up to a very positive first impression for me. Now the size of the lens, it is 80.3 millimeters in diameter or 3.2 inches. It is 102 millimeters in overall length. I'll pop off the hood so you can see that. And that is 4 inches. It has a fairly small 6-7 millimeter front filter thread, though as we'll see in just a bit, it has surprisingly low vignette for having such a relatively small entrance pupil there. The weight of the lens is 540 grams, which is obviously lightweight compared to a lot of 85mm lenses, though it is not as light as the lightest in the class, which is Samyang's 85mm f1.4 Series 2 lens. And that lens weighs 509 grams, so 31 grams lighter than this one. Probably not enough to be a deal breaker, obviously. That's 1.4 pounds for those of you that speak imperial. Now, one thing that stood out to me is that Sirui, over the last number of years, I've reviewed, I think, about a dozen of their lenses or so. And one thing that I think that they've done very well is to have very unique, different designs with different materials than what other brands are using. That's a little less true here. We have a little bit more conventional lens, but I will say that definitely the difference is that they're fairly aggressive with their fonts that they use on here, which are a little bit bolder and stronger than what I typically think. The lens hood itself is relatively plain. It does have a little bit of a grip section here, but the plastics, they'll flex a little bit. It doesn't seem to be particularly high end to me. I also noted that the tolerance in mounting it, it's just a little bit tight, and so it feels like a tight fit, but not necessarily a great fit. Now, this is a very feature-rich lens, and one of the things that stood out to me is the fact that they have really improved on the overall feature set of the lens. And so that starts with a really thorough approach to aperture. And so aperture, we have the option of having nice clicks at 1/3 stop detents. There is that big gap between f/16 and the automatic mode if you want to control it from within the camera. We also have the ability to declick the aperture and to smoothly rack through all of the different aperture options. So a very good kind of hybrid approach for video as well. I will note that inside the aperture itself is gorgeous. 15 rounded blades, so helping you to maintain very circular, specular shapes even when you stop way down. It still looks pretty circular even when it stopped all the way down to the minimum aperture of f/16. So that's pretty awesome. Over on the left side of the lens, we have a couple of other features. We have an AF/MF switch, always welcome. And then we have a custom button, function button here, AFL as they're calling it, which can be programmed to a variety of functions from within the camera itself. One other feature here is that on the actual lens mount, there is a USB-C port, much like what Viltrox does, and so you can do quick firmware updates. While I have this off, I'll also note that there is a rubber gasket here. There are internal seals. There's a flooring front coating on the lens itself. Now, Sirui's language in their marketing, they use the word weatherproof or waterproof, I think, actually. I wouldn't test that by dunking it in water or anything. However, if you're going out in the rain, at least you should be safe with that. As noted, there are 2 included filters right now. One of those is a UV filter / protection filter. Nice enough. It's got multi-coatings, the nano coating on there. I'm not personally a big fan of using UV filters at this point, particularly when you've already got flooring coating on the front element. I think that that's protection enough, in my opinion. And anytime you add glass elements, you are adding the potential for degraded image quality. The other filter, however, is a little more interesting to me, and it is a black mist filter. And the purpose of this is to add just a little bit of a softer look, kind of a glow to images that can be flattering for portraits in particular. And you can see here, there is definitely a difference between having no filter and then having that black mist filter attached. So it might be a look that really appeals to you. The lens itself is actually really nicely made. It's aluminum alloy chassis here, which has a nice level of build quality. The manual focus ring has a pretty decent level of damping and moves fairly good. And overall build quality is nice here. The minimum focus distance is 85 centimeters, very average, and the resulting magnification of 0.12 times, also very average. And so nothing really exceptional in that regard. However, we do have a nicely built lens. The only thing that feels kind of cheap is the lens hood itself, but everything else is pretty impressive. So let's move on and talk about autofocus here. This has an STM or stepping motor, and as you can see here, focus speed is quite good. It's not at GM's level, but I would say it's close to the Sigma DN lens in terms of the focus speed. That also has an STM focus motor, and so it's fast enough that I didn't really notice any kind of focus related issues unless I was doing like a really major, close to infinity kind of rack. Then I could tell just a hint of slowdown, you know, like the new GM Mark II lens, that would be an instantaneous focus change, and it's just a hair slower here. I did get very good accuracy, however, on pet eyes. You can see the shots of Ferrari, whether it's front on, but even if it's on the side, and I'm just getting him in profile, I got very good focus on the eyes. I did a portrait session with my wife, and at various focus distances, whether it be close, medium, or a little bit further away, overall, I had zero issues as far as my focus accuracy. It would lock onto the eye. It would deliver, appropriately focused results. I also found kind of in general, like birthday or holiday celebrations, just kind of the shooting around the table or in a room type look that, again, focus picked up quickly on what I wanted it to and delivered accurately focused results. So in general, I would say that focus accuracy for stills was good. Focus is quiet. I mean, you're only going to hear any kind of focus noise if you put your ear right up next to the barrel, no problem. So how about video AF? Well, first of all, I was actually quite impressed with the look of the video focus pulls. They were actually fast and confident, no visible steps, no hunting, no settling, none of those things. So quick back and forth. You do see that there's some focus breathing there and that kind of pull that you are going to notice. When I transitioned over to my hand test, I actually thought that went really well too. It never missed a beat in terms of transitions from the hand to the eye. Moving fairly quickly. You might want to detune that a little bit in camera if you want a little more cinematic look. But again, I wasn't displeased with it at all. I also found that in other real-world focus transitions that they looked good. And so overall, I actually thought that the quality of focus in video was fairly good. I did have this one shot where I was panning from a close target towards a bigger scene, and you can see that focus just kind of got stuck, and it didn't really want to make that transition in the way that I wanted, but that fortunately was an exception to the rule. I had other clips where I did a similar kind of shot and it picked it up fine. One thing I will say about the footage is it has a look. It's a little bit lower contrast, and the optical glass has a different look than what any of the other 85mm lenses on Sony that I've tested. And so, you just either that you're going to like or you're not going to like that. It's kind of a taste related thing. But as far as focus goes, a good job here, at least on the Sony platform. Now this lens is also going to be available on Nikon Z mount and then on Fuji X mount. And so it's APC platform, and so it'll function a little bit differently. And so I would say probably with my experience with those platforms, I'm probably seeing the best focus here on Sony. Nikon's going to be close, just a little bit behind, and it's going to be reduced a fair bit on Fuji because of all the limitations that you're probably already aware of if you're a Fuji shooter. All right, let's talk about the image quality here. And so obviously I'll be giving you a quick overview, and then there is a breakdown to follow after that, the deep dive for those of you that are interested. Optical formula is 14 elements in 9 groups. That includes HR, ED, extra low dispersion, and then aspherical elements, as you can see. The MTF chart shows a pretty consistently good performance across the frame, but not exceptional. And one thing that actually stood out to me, that even as soon as I saw the MTF chart and I saw the notes, that the testing distance was 3.4 meters, which is quite far for a lens like this. And I think that the reason for that is that what I found is that this is a lens that tends to be optimized for a certain focus distance. And so up close performance, so-so. Contrast, it seems to drop a fair bit. And then at infinity, I wasn't really impressed with the performance at infinity at all. There's for a couple of reasons that we'll detail in the optical breakdown, but it's never like razor sharp out in infinity. However, in a sweet spot of between 2.5 and 5 meters, let's say 8 to 20 feet, the lens is very obviously at its best at that distance. And so at that zone, I found like contrast looked better even at f1.4. I found that there's just a better performance in general. Now, when I begin to dive into the details, I found that longitudinal chromatic aberration, which is the type I would expect to find on an 85mm f1.4 lens, that actually looked pretty good. But what surprised me is that I definitely saw some lateral style chromatic aberrations. And I think that that's part of the reason why it doesn't perform fantastic at a infinity distance or a landscape distance, is because there is some of that fringing. And while you can take away the fringing, you don't get that contrast back. And so the details aren't quite as crisp. And so I did notice in some higher contrast landscape scenes, even at smaller apertures, they just never were quite as sharp as what I wanted. Now, really good news when it comes to the amount of vignette here on Sony, I only saw a +38, which is a little over a stop, which is not bad at all. Definitely best, say, the Sigma 85mm f1.4 DM, which I had to pretty much max out the sliders. And kind of like that Sigma lens, this has some pincushion distortion, more so than what I saw from Samyang or any of the Sony options in the past. In this case, it took a -7 to correct that pincushion distortion. Not as severe as what I saw on Sigma, which is really noticeable. It took about a -12 to correct there. And so it has some of the same tendencies, just not as extreme. Now, if we look at sharpness, and again, I'm testing at a 61 megapixel level, so that's the highest, at least on Sony or Nikon, that's the highest level you're going to deal with. Obviously, if you're shooting on Fuji on their 40 megapixel APS-C sensor, that's actually a greater pixel density by a good margin. So it's going to struggle the most in that particular application. But as far as full frame, this is as difficult as it gets at this point. And what I found in my crops, looking at 200% magnification, is that the detail is pretty good, but the contrast is unexceptional. Focus distance for doing my tests is going to be right under 2 meters for that. And at that distance, I would say it's not as contrasty as what it would be at the 3 meter distance. If you stop down to f1.8 or f2, you'll find that the contrast will begin to improve at that point. I would say that for most people, it's going to be sharp enough for portrait work. Don't expect everything to just pop as far as the contrast for portraits. And maybe that's not necessarily what you're looking for. It's not going to have as many fine details. You're obviously not going to resolve pores and things like that the same. Of course, not everybody wants their pores to be resolved. But the trade-off here is that the bokeh is maybe the best of any of the 85mm f1.4s I've seen on Sony. It's really soft, really creamy. It's kind of, in many ways, it's kind of like the anti-GM Mark II lens. I was blown away by the acuity of that lens. You can shoot at f1.4 at a distant landscape scene, and you can deeply crop because all the fine details are just perfectly resolved. That is just not true at all here. But I kind of knocked the GM2 in my review because I just felt like the overall rendering, the bokeh was just, it was only so-so. This is pretty exceptional in that regard. And so it's kind of, the strengths and the weaknesses are basically polar opposite on these two lenses. The contrast starts looking good by f2.8. But as noted previously, while you sharpen up, in your sweet spot, I didn't find that the landscape results ever got really exceptional. As typical, diffraction will begin at f11, become very noticeable by f16. But really the strength here is the bokeh. It is really, really beautiful, very creamy. Now, when it comes to specular highlights, geometry is pretty good, but you still will get some deformation near the edge of the frame. What did surprise me is that there's kind of not quite onion bokeh in there, but there's definitely some busyness in the bokeh circles, specular highlights. But If you're out in other type shots, just its ability to make backgrounds look really soft and creamy, it's really quite exceptional in that regard, and that is definitely the standout behavior of the lens. And I think that's the real reason why a lot of people are quite positive about the lens, is because for its kind of intended main target for portraits, it does create a very pretty look as far as the bokeh rendering. I also found that the flare resistance is very good overall, and even at its kind of most flare prone with the sun kind of at an angle right out of frame, it creates this kind of warm glow localized effect that frankly is a look that I've added to hundreds of images in the past, because it just kind of amps up the overall look of them. And so the fact that you can get that in camera, of course, is probably something that will please a lot of portrait photographers. It's just kind of a warm glow. The one thing I will say also that has been kind of a truism of Sirui so far and remains true here is that I don't necessarily love the optical glass. The colors to me are only so-so, and they tend to, at some points to me, to just kind of fall apart. They're not particularly rich, in my opinion. That's a taste thing, obviously. It's subjective, so your mileage may vary when it comes to that. But that's just my kind of overall feel when it comes to that. And so some definite strengths and weaknesses. I wouldn't say any kind of great weaknesses. It's not as sharp and contrasty as some of the other lenses. So my conclusion is, I don't think that I'm quite as wowed as some other reviews. I've seen some fairly hyperbolic reviews already of this lens that, make it out to be like the best available on the Sony platform. I will say that if you're just talking about bokeh, I could probably go there with that argument. But I would say also that it's not nearly as sharp and overall contrasty at wide apertures as some of the competing lenses. For example, it's only $100 less at the moment than the slightly smaller and lighter Samyang 85 f1.4 Series 2. And that lens, I would say, I probably like the overall blend of attributes a little bit better personally, though this lens does have more features. It's superior in some elements. I do love the upgraded packaging, the features, the presentation. This is a great lens for those in particular who care more about the look of images rather than at actually pixel peeping. And if that happens to describe you, then you may just really love this lens. I think I will probably throw together a future video because I happen to own the Sigma 85DM. Yes, it costs twice as much, but for those of you that are interested in seeing how this holds up and whether or not this lens could be enough for you, I'll try to satisfy that at least bit of curiosity with a video comparison in the future. If you want more information right now, you can check out either the text review that's linked in the description down below. There's also an image gallery there and some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. Or if you want a deeper dive into the optical performance, stay tuned with me right now. We'll jump into it together. All right, so starting by taking a quick look at vignette and distortion. As far as the distortion goes, you can see that there is a pincushion distortion. This is manually corrected with a +7. It's good and linear, no real issues there. There's a mild amount of vignette, but a +42 to correct for that. Again, very simple to correct for. And frankly, in real-world shots, you'll see that in all the images I show you at f1.4, there's been no correction, and it's not really an issue. I never noticed anything that I thought needed correction. Now, frankly, it's a good thing that we don't need correction because, as you can see here from the JPEG, at least at this stage, I'm not seeing any kind of in-camera correction. And so JPEGs and RAWs look the exact same. I've actually added a third of a stop of light to this RAW image. Otherwise, it would look identical to the JPEG. Now, as mentioned previously, on some fringing fronts, not too bad. You can see here very mild amounts of longitudinal style chromatic aberration, a little bit before, a little bit afterward, no big deal there. But on this kind of like real-world torture test, where a lot of times I'll see bad fringing, either in this lettering or in the edges of the camera, frankly, not bad at all. Also, not really a lot around these highlights. You can see what I referred to previously, though, about the general busyness that's just there in those specular highlights. Not completely the onion look, but kind of almost like planetary bodies or something, just a little bit of a swirl effect in there. But what I did definitely see is a fair bit of this kind of fringing, which is the lateral style chromatic aberrations. They show up near the edges of the frame, and in this case, it's not just the edges of the frame that I see, but for example, in an image like this, as I poke in and look at a pixel level, you can see around these ducks or these geese, for example, there's fringing in there. means that the textures are not like super sharp and just kind of robbed a bit. And you can see that there's some of that fringing all throughout these bare branches. Now, the problem with this style of fringing is we stop down a bit. Here's to f2.8. The fringing is going to still be there. You're still going to see it in the branches. It doesn't really go away. And as you can see, it doesn't really sharpen up as much as what I would like to personally see. And I think that lateral style chromatic aberration has a bit of a factor in that. Now, as noted, the lens does come with a black mist filter, and this is without the filter on the left, this is with the filter on the right, and you can see that it adds kind of just a glow effect. If we look in at a pixel level at Nala's face here, you can see that one has just kind of a softer, kind of almost like the black levels have been raised a bit, whereas in this case, you can see that the contrast is a little bit more intense. The effect's a little more obvious in this particular shot. So first of all, if you look at it at a global level, you can see that the background looks just a little bit softer, almost a little bit more cinematic, and it can be useful for, obviously, for shooting video as well. But here's the non-filtered look. You can see contrast is a little bit better. Here is with the black mist filter on there, and you can see, again, it's just a softer type look. Either you like it or you don't, but it is there, freely available. Now, as noted previously, here's the test chart, and we're going to look at 200% magnification, 61 megapixels. Detail is really not too bad. You can see just a little bit of that fringing that is there that is going to reduce a little bit. But you can see that contrast is not off the charts. I don't see any kind of moire pattern in there because contrast and detail isn't really intense enough. Likewise here, it doesn't actually looks pretty good as far as some of the detail here, but at the same time, contrast is not exceptional. We look down in this area, you can see that really both sides are fairly equal, but on all of it, it's just the contrast is not intense down here in the corner. You can definitely see, of course, as we get towards the fringing that's really localized at the edges, but even here in general, you can just see contrast is a bit lower. So out in the real world at f1.4 here, you can see that, again, detail is there, but it's everything, all the kind of textures just still seem a little bit muddy to my eye, just not really exceptional. And so, again, it's not like there's a big drop off towards the edge. It's just that in general, none of the textures really pop the way that they could or do with other lenses. And for portraits, this is a JPEG, and so you can see that the detail it's okay. Again, contrast is okay, but it's not like exceptionally crisp. In this shot, more of a casual shot, well focused, and there's sufficient detail, but not exceptional detail. So again, it's all about what your expectations are. Now, stopping down to f1.8, you can see contrast is definitely starting to improve there in the center of the frame. From f1.8 to f2, mostly about the same. But if we go from f2 to f2.8, you can see the beginning of some of that moire pattern starting to come as contrast is starting to get better. I'll pop back over here and look at a mid-frame result. You can see a definite improvement on this side. And over on this side also, you can see it's definitely starting to look a lot better. And down into the corners definitely looking crisper also. Here's a real-world shot at f2.8, and you can see that detail looks, pretty good there. Not exceptional, but quite good. At f5.6 and f8, you're going to be achieving your kind of maximum potential there. And then at f11, there'll be a little bit of softening due to diffraction, and a bit more at f16, though it's not like a dramatic reduction either. You can see here that up-close performance at f1.4, it is not really what I would call exceptionally good, and definitely not super high detail or contrast. It seems fairly flat plane of focus, so that's not too bad. But again, what really stands out here to me is not that, which is I've seen a whole lot sharper than that, but really the overall softness of this shot, which I take quite regularly, is really good. And so here's the lock I often take a photo of, and you can see that its ability to just completely defocus the background is pretty sweet. This shot, I think, is, kind of shows the highlights. There's sufficient detail and contrast in there to look good. And then the overall scene, I think, just looks really fantastic. All of these kind of harder edges of other grasses really handled quite artistically. Great job. Here, we're closer to the kind of sweet spot for contrast. And so you can see that looks really good. and the background remains very, very creamy. This shot too, I think, is really kind of a standout of the best qualities of this lens, shooting in the zone where contrast is maybe towards its best. And again, the background just looks really defocused. And then, of course, the strength for portrait work is not that it's going to be blindingly sharp, but your ability to really strongly defocus a background and to get a really pleasing background blur even at a medium distance like this. Flare resistance, for the most part, I'm going to say is a strength. You really can't tell from this image, but there is massive amounts of light that is coming through a window and kind of flooding this scene, but it's holding up just fine. Sun is intense right there, and you can see there's a little bit of a localized veiling, but no big ghosting artifacts. Stop down, a little bit of a ghosting pattern here, but really not bad. And then, of course, this video clip, I think, really shows, even at its worst, it's maybe even at its best as far as having an artistic glow to the image itself. So overall, for me, it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but it's all about what you're looking for in an optical performance. So hopefully a look at the optics of this baby has helped you to decide whether or not it is a lens worth buying for you. As always, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and let the light in.